Hello everybody, and welcome to the second part of our Python 3 Basics tutorial series. In this series what we're going to be doing is talking a little bit more about the print function as well as strings. Since they go hand in hand, it just makes sense to cover them together. So let's go ahead and get started. So in the previous chapter we talked about just a simple print, and we did print hello world like that. Now what we're going to be talking about is some of the rules of the print function. So the print function is going to act like any other Python function, which we'll have to cover in a little bit, but a function basically has its name, and then you put parameters of a function within these round brackets. So the print function, all it's going to do is just output whatever text we put in, or really whatever we put in as the parameter. Now this could be text, this could be a variable, this could be all sorts of things, but for now we're just doing simple strings, which strings are just text. So as far as strings are concerned, what are some of the rules of strings? Well, first of all, we have to have obviously some sort of quotes around our strings, so we've used single quotes, but we can also have double quotes, so we can do something like this, double quotes. And that will also work. Let's go ahead and save and run that just to see our output. So there you go, you have hello world, double quotes. So we see they both kind of act similarly. We already know that we can have single quotes. The other thing that we can do is something like this. So we can say print, and then we can do what's known as concatenation. So we can do something like this. Concatenate plus, and then TION, so for concatenation. And what concatenation is going to do is going to add these two things together. Now there's two ways that you can put things together. This is the first with this plus sign. So we can save and run that again, and we see that concatenation actually put these two things together, so it looks like it's all one, but obviously in the program it was not. But we can also do something like this. So we can do hello, and then another way you can join things is with a comma there. And if we save and run that, we'll notice a slight difference where hello there actually came with a bit of a space, and that space is because we used a comma. Now, why might the developers of Python decide that there's two ways to put things together, plus and a comma, and the comma just is a space? Like, why not just add the space ourselves if we wanted it? Well, the reason for this is actually not for strings at all. The purpose is for if we want to combine strings and something like integers. So the following would be an example of why. So we would say something like I and comma 5, let's say. Meaningless, but let's go ahead and run it. And we see the output here is I am 5. But what if we, instead of this comma, tried to use a plus? Now we're also going to see the scripting language, line by line characteristic of Python, because everything up to this point here is going to work, but this will fail. So anyways, let's go ahead and run that. I am plus 5, and we see that we can't convert an object to a string implicitly. Basically what it's saying is you can't add integers to strings. That's pretty much it. And actually what it actually tries to do here is add a string to a string, because it started with a string, and I found it could not do that. But what if we did something like this? 5 plus I am, like that, we would get a different one, a different error, right? Because initially it was trying to call a string as an int, an int as a string, and this time it said that we can't add a string to an int using, the addition. Now I know that might feel like there's a lot of rules already, but we actually have a few more that we have to cover. The next thing that we need to know is how do we add something like the following. Let's say we wanted to say I'm 5. Right, since we're apparently fans of I5, we'll say like this, I'm 5. Well, obviously that's not going to work out, because what we've attempted to use as an apostrophe, we can't, because it's thinking at it as some sort of closing quote, and then we've got an open quote here. Obviously this isn't going to work. It's going to say invalid syntax because we've got this random floating unclosed stuff here, and then a random M that makes no sense. So how do we get around this sort of scenario? Well, there's actually 3 ways that we can handle this. The first is with an escape character, which is the backslash, which is the key that's right above your enter key. So for example, the backslash is an escaped character. And what it's going to do for you is any character that you add this escaped character before, it's going to escape from the characteristic of that character. So in this sense, this is actually, it has a characteristic of beginning and ending strings, where if we put this backslash here, this escaped character here, it takes away that characteristic and just treats it like an ASCII character. So we can run this. Oops, we still left this one. Let's get rid of that. And in fact, let's clear away all of these just so we're back, just simplistic here. Now we see I'm 5, and it was able to print that. So that's the first way that we can handle this. The second way that we can handle this is instead of having single quotes here on the outside, we can make these double quotes, like this. And now, these double quotes initiate this whole sort of statement, right? And then the single quote is treated like a single quote and not the beginning or end of a string. So we can run that, and it says, I'm 5. Now the third way is a little less conventional, and there's really no great reason for it unless you wanted to quote somebody. So for example, let's say you didn't want to use escaped characters, and instead of I'm 5, you wanted to say, he said, and instead of single quotes, instead of like hi, like that, using single quotes, you wanted to use double quotes. Now we see that we're having trouble. Well, we can actually get around this as well using a very similar practice, and that would as the second option, and we can just use single quotes to encase the double quotes, and we can see he said hi in double quotes. So those are 3 ways that we can get around the whole issue of quotes and all of that. And another thing to keep in mind with the escaped character, now that we've taught the escaped character, we might not cover it too much more in these basics, but the escaped character is often the character used in file paths. And so later on when we specify a certain path to a file, generally Windows displays file paths like this, // let's say users, blah, 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 blah. You have to be very careful because it's going to use that backslash, and you can see that this backslash will escape characters, and sometimes it causes a lot of trouble. So you can either fix that with double backslashes, or you can just change the backslashes to /. So that's going to conclude this chapter, and in the next chapter we're going to be talking about numbers, ints, and floats. So, hello and welcome to chapter 5 in the Python 3 Basics tutorial video. In this video we're going to be talking about the while loop in Python 3. There are basically 2 major loops within the Python programming language, and that is the while loop and the for loop. The for loop we'll be covering in chapter 6, but for now we're going to be talking about the while loop. The while loop basically does what it sounds like. It basically asks the question, while something is the case, do something. Now, this is going to bring up the conditional operators within Python, but luckily the conditional operators make a whole lot of sense, so we should have no problem covering the 2 of them all at once. So with that, let's get started. So the while loop is going to say, while a condition is such, do something. And then it's going to continue running whatever block of code, and by block of code I mean basically a chunk of code that is underneath something and tabbed over. I'll explain that when I show it. Basically it's going to run that block of code until the condition is no longer the case. So the easiest way to show that would be a simple counter while loop. So we'll say condition as our variable equals 1, and then we're going to say while condition, and we're going to say is less than 10, colon, and this is what makes Python kind of nice, is generally, well basically all of the programming languages have what are called standards. And most programming languages don't actually require anybody to have good standards. And what I mean by standards is kind of like your code's organization, so to speak. So when we write this colon, when we hit the return or enter key, we see that we're actually automatically tabbed over a little bit. And now what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to print condition, and then we're going to go ahead and do condition, and then we're going to do a slightly confusing operation, but have no fear, plus equals 1. And what plus equals does is it just adds 1 to the value. So basically it's kind of like condition plus equals 1 is basically the exact same as, for example, condition equals condition plus 1. That's basically what plus equal 1 will do for us. So I'm going to get rid of this. And in fact, actually, I'll show real quickly commenting in Python. So we can leave this here, and we can do what is called a comment in Python. And a single line comment is designated with the pound sign. So this number sign, pound sign. You can also do multi-line comments with a triple quote, like that. And in here, multiple lines can go here, like that. So anyways, a short diversion there, but back to what we were doing in our while loop. And so we have condition plus equals 1. Let me move this down just to make it pretty clear, like that. And that is all the while loop does. So what we can do now is we can save and run this, and we get the output as being 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then after 9, it stops. So here we were basically asking, while condition was less than 10, it prints the condition. So we saw while it was 1, that was okay, so it printed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then at 9, that was the last time the condition was less than 10. So that worked out. And the conditional operator is the less than sign. Now, we can go and do something more, and we could say, well, we could do something that, like the following. So we could say condition equals 5. Okay. Now, we can ask the question, while condition is less than 15, print true. So let's save and run that. And we throw an error. Because this condition here is a string. So we cannot do that. Now, if we get rid of this, and we run this, we're going to find a lot of trues are being printed out to our console, and we want to stop that. So to stop it from doing that, if you find yourself in an infinite loop, or you just want to stop your script for whatever reason, you could hit the X to X out, or you can do Control-C, and that will break the script. So this generated an infinite loop, because 5 will always be less than 15. Now there is one more way to do an infinite loop, and a much cleaner way to do an infinite loop. Basically what is happening in this while statement is a while statement is going to either return a true or a false. So the easiest way to make an infinite loop would be while true. Do something, and we could say print infinite, like that. So, and actually we'd never make it to this, so I'm going to go ahead and comment out these 2 lines because this loop here would never end. We can save and run this. And we see we have an infinite amount of infinites. We'll break this, maybe. Doesn't want to break, took a little bit there. Sometimes there's like a backup queue, so don't be too frustrated if it doesn't stop immediately. So that is it for Chapter 5 in the while loop. In the next chapter, what we're going to be covering is the for loop. So stay tuned for that. Hello everybody, and welcome to Chapter 6 of the Python 3.4 tutorial series. In this video, we're going to be talking about the for loop. Now, the for loop is used for many of the same exact tasks as the while loop. Generally, you might see the while loop being used more for what I would call finite tasks, although we saw that the while loop is very popular for the infinite loop task. But generally, you have a very structured amount in mind when you use the while loop. And the for loop is used for tasks that might have variable time frames or uncertain time frames that you don't know at the time of your program. Now that said, the for loop and the while loop can almost always be interchanged as far as the actual task that they complete. Now personally, I prefer the for loop in most situations, but a lot of times it's going to come down to personal preference, so it's important to know both, and I do use both. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So let's say for for loop, for example, generally a for loop is often used with a list. So we're going to make an example list, and we're going to call it example list. And even though we haven't covered lists, a Python list is just encased in square brackets, and then you make a list. You do not have to copy my exact list, but let's just say the list is 1, 6, 7, 3, 6, 9, and 0. Now, what we use for loops for, again, most often is to iterate through a list, or at least what I tend to use them for most, but maybe other people use them differently. Now we can say for x in example list, colon, enter, and here we have the block of code that will go underneath our for loop and the automatic standards that come with Python. So for x in example list, and for now, let's just print x. And what this does is it basically says for x in example list, so we could actually say for, maybe an easier way to think about this would be for thing in example list, print thing. Okay, so it's going to print 1673690. Okay, so let's save and run that. And sure enough, it prints out 1673690, just as we expected. Now, even though people tend to use for loops mostly to iterate through lists like this, you can also use a for loop as a very quick way to make a counter. So if you recall, our while loop required us to say x equals 1, then while x is less than 100 or whatever, do blah, 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 blah. That actually kind of was a lot of lines to add, and maybe you didn't want to do that much. So another thing that you can do with Python 3, and really any version of Python with the for loop, is for x in range, and then we can say 1 to 11, print x. So we're still going to do this first for loop, but just forget about that and look at the second loop's printout. So that would be here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So basically 1 to 10. And what range is doing is range generates a list, numbers, 1 through the end of the list. And what it's going to do is it's going to start at this number and go up to this number, but not actually hit this number. Hence why we only got to 10, not 11. Range in Python 3, if you are familiar with Python 2.7, range does what Python 2.7's X range did, and actually Python 2.7's X range was based on Python 3's range, because range is a much better function. And what we've actually created here is a generator, and if we wanted to, we could generate this list and do this. And we're not actually going to let it finish this entire iteration, but I'm just going to show it as an example how quickly it begins to print those numbers. You saw how fast these numbers got generated. Now in the old days, and without range being a generator, this generation of 1 to, I don't even know what number this is, would normally have created a gigantic list that was stored in your memory, and it would have literally, even if you had 64-bit Python, I've got 32 gigs of RAM, would estimate that this probably would have blown out even my RAM. So anyway, that's the idea of a generator function as well, but maybe more on those later. So let's return back to the range being more like 11, and that's it. So that's going to conclude the for loop with Python 3. The next chapter is going to be concerning the if statement, so stay tuned.